Mihi, Claire, for that introduction and opening up the space for us. Kia ora koutou katoa. Thank you for joining me today. And as Claire said, with the numbers online, I am both equally excited and nervous for the number of people listening. But I think those numbers talk to the fact that this is an important discussion that needs to be had. And I actually think lots of people are already thinking about this. And for some of you, this will be new thinking, and for others, it'll be affirming what you already knew. So my presentation today will firstly cover my history and my positioning, moving on to child protection and child protection training's history and its framing and how that sits alongside colonisation. And then I will share my journey with my reflections of delivering child protection training to communities across Aotearoa. So history is critical in understanding where our ideas come from, as is our positioning. So firstly, I want to establish from the very start my positioning in this work. I am not positioning myself as an expert in any of the fields I will be discussing in child protection, in decolonising child protection or child protection training, but I have spent a lot of time working in and thinking about and trying to do better in all of those spaces. So today is about me sharing my journey in working in these spaces, my reflections in doing that work, and what I've learned along the way, in the hope that you can then reflect on what I share and grow collective thinking. I certainly don't think I've got all the answers, and I certainly don't think I've resolved it all. So on that note, ko waio, who am I and what informs my knowledge? Ko Reading me Liverpool, Ingarangi, nā whanua o Okutipuna, I te puakio I Plymouth, Ingarangi. I te tau 2008, I haere mai o ki Aotearoa. E noho ana o ki whakatū anai nei, hei tangata tariti ahau, ko tauwhero ahau, ko Ruth Browning toku ingoa. Kei te mihi ahau ki te mana whanua o tēnei wahi. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. So what I just said is that my families hail from Reading and Liverpool, and I grew up in Plymouth, England. And I moved to Aotearoa in 2008, and I now live in Whakatū with my husband and my two boys. I'm grateful for Te Tiriti enabling my residence here, and I do all I can to support the mana of Te Tiriti, especially in the current political climate. I'm a social worker, but I came into that work via a sociology and criminal justice degree, which taught me that societal structures are constructs and how they can create inequity. I then gained a social research master's, which taught me analytical skills and a critical lens. And then I somehow ended up using none of those degrees to work as a bail support worker in a youth justice team in England. And that is where I met social workers. And that's where I established my values and my sense of purpose. Since that time, I've worked in care and protection, NGO family social work, and school social work. And I finally gained my social work qualification in 2015 via Otago University, where I then learned about colonisation and Aotearoa's social work landscape. So I've got a European worldview, and I can reflect on what that means for my work. I grew up with white privilege in a safe family environment, sheltered from the impacts of poverty. But I did that growing up in the third most deprived area of England. So poverty, social injustice, inequity, and racism was all around me, and I saw it. So I share that with you because that's really informed my approach when I came into the work of child protection training. And it's also informed the changes that I've attempted to bring to that space. I worked for 5 years for Safeguarding Children New Zealand, developing and delivering their safeguarding and child protection training. And that is where I did all of the work that I'm sharing today. So I very recently left Safeguarding Children, as Claire referred to, and moved to Te Whatu Ora. I'm week 3 in the role of delivering training for hospital staff via the Violence Intervention Programme. Now, today I don't speak on behalf of either organisation, because this is today about how I have experienced delivering training with my specific background and knowledge, and the journey I went on in adapting that training with what I knew and what I wanted to do with it. So all the content that I developed in collaboration with my colleagues is still used at Safeguarding Children, but I'm no longer delivering that. So I just wanted to be really clear about all of that, because positioning is critical, as I'm going to be discussing. So we can see on this timeline, on this slide, key developments in child protection and associated child protection training. We can see in the first slide that charities have been the driving force of such work, starting in the UK with rescue movements, Dr. Barnardo's Homes and the National Society for the Protection of Children. So those were the movements that started the work of child protection and child protection training in the UK, with governments taking responsibility for the protection of children in the 1920s, between the 1920s and 50s in the UK, but with charities maintaining the training and advocacy work in that space. So we can see along the lines how that's then developed. So with the NSPCC between the 1960s and 1980s, developing child protection training for social workers, teachers and health staff in the UK. And then in that timeline as well, Australian charities were established that were doing the same work. And then in the 1990s to 2000s, mandatory reporting laws around child protection were brought in the USA and Canada. And the NSPCC in England and Barnardo's and Save the Children internationally began to deliver official child protection training programs. And in that timeline, New Zealand child protection charities were also established. And then we move into the 2000s to the present, where we've got multiple child protection trainers providing that training in New Zealand, UK, and Australia. And the training is extended to volunteers, sports, faith sector, and parents. But there's also now been global moves in safeguarding and child protection training towards rights-based approaches, cultural safety, and decolonising practice. So we also know that the colonisation of Aotearoa occurred along the same timeline. So these key developments in child protection history have come to these shores, and child protection has been a key element in the colonisation of Aotearoa. So we've got a well-documented history of high rates of tamariki Māori being taken into state care, with the earliest reasons being rescued from their perceived poverty, and with a subsequent loss of connection to whakapapa and then abuse in care. No, I'm not an expert on that history, but there are plenty of academics that are, having written on that subject in New Zealand. So Dr. Ian Hislop, Dr. Kerry Cleaver, Professor Emily Keddle, Professor Leonie Pihima, and many, many others. I've probably missed out heaps of really important people there, but those are the ones that I currently know about. And I've reflected on some of that work during my journey, and it has informed my thinking. So I came into the work of developing and delivering child protection training and could see that this training had the potential for promoting the importance of a Eurocentric model over and above Indigenous ways of being and doing, and therefore and reinforcing implicit bias. I saw that if we said in a training, this is the way to do things to protect children and effectively respond to concerns, that framing could result in Māori and Pacific workers thinking that their cultural practices of safeguarding and protecting children are less safe and they should do things this way, essentially continuing the colonisation arrow into present times. I saw that if I didn't talk about implicit bias and specifically checking ourselves for that and racism, that the training could end up reinforcing the over-reporting and monitoring of Māori and Pacific families by all people that were exposed to that training. I could see the care to prison pipeline, and I was very conscious I didn't want to be facilitating a feeding of that pipeline from community services who were wanting to do the right thing by responding to children and young people and keeping them safe. But mostly I knew that due to colonisation, the people most impacted by violence, abuse and neglect in this country were Māori and Pacific whānau. And I sat with the question, how could the answer to that be a response model that was dominated by Western Eurocentric responses? So I also received feedback after training from some kaimahi that they wanted the training to be more culturally appropriate for Aotearoa. So I had work to do. All of that said, it is increasingly recognised that everyone that is likely to come into contact with children, young people and their families knows what abuse and neglect can look like and knows safe and appropriate responses within their role. So it's critical that when responding to child abuse and neglect, people have the practical skills of knowing what to say and what not to say when someone discloses harm. They need to understand what information the law allows them to share about people when they feel it's necessary to protect those victims of harm. So when I started in this work, I reflected on the fact that I had worked in social services at that point with vulnerable young people, children and their families for 20 years, and had never been trained on how to recognize signs of non-accidental injury, how to record them, or how to respond to a disclosure from a child. I'd not been trained on how to safely share information relevant to children's well-being and safety, all the dynamics of professional dangerousness. I learned all that on the job, which varied across the different agencies I worked in. So I could see the importance of child protection training. And I also learned that I wasn't alone in that, as in the trainings I was delivering, many people were telling me they'd not learned those skills in their professional training either. So I knew the importance on future investigations of how signs, indicators, injuries, and disclosures are responded to, and that these practical skills were critical for workers close to children and their families to be confident in. So I knew the importance of this training for social services staff, as well as community workers, health workers, teachers, sports workers, and early childhood educators who would all come into contact with these sorts of concerns fairly regularly. So as we can see on the slide, firstly, social workers, educators, ECE and school teachers, and some health staff learn about colonisation, systemic inequity, and to reflect on their own implicit bias within their work, in their study. That's in undergraduate degrees. They also need to learn the practical skills that I've just been referring to. And even if they manage to get those practical skills trainings in their degrees, it's the type of learning that needs to be refreshed regularly, because if it's not used regularly, it's easily forgotten. Like, for example, you might not receive a disclosure for some time after qualifying. And when it comes up, you may have forgotten what you learned in your undergraduate degree about that practical skill. So I've met lots of social workers who say they haven't learned enough of those practical skills of the recognizing and responding to child abuse and neglect. And then secondly, we've got other services working with people who might not have received that structural systemic understandings in their professional training or their learnings in getting into those roles. So they need that practical skills training in the child protection training, but they also, if learning those skills alone without an understanding of the structural conditions, the societal drivers of violence, that runs the risk of reinforcing inequity, because implicit bias unchecked could mean over-reporting and more stringent monitoring of people that our societal structures create as more risky, more concerning. So there are also forms of harm that are harder to identify, like sexual harm, which is more often overlooked by professionals as it's more concealed, and professionals don't know what to look for, and often aren't confident in that role. So training has been shown to assist in developing that confidence in responding to, in recognizing those forms of harm and responding to them safely and appropriately. So as we can see, that's why we need child protection training. And so I was sat with the tension of knowing what I know and how to reconcile these positions and knowings, that we need this training, but I don't want this training to be that Eurocentric model, potentially reinforcing systemic inequity and implicit bias. So what to do? I leaned into my social work values to guide me in what to do and how to do it. My question was, how can I deliver this training, ensuring I'm upholding rangatiratanga, valuing diversity and cultural identity, using our practice to advocate and support self-determination and the empowerment of others? How can I deliver this training and ensure that I'm upholding manakitanga, recognizing and supporting the mana of others, practicing empathic solidarity, ensuring a safe space whilst acknowledging boundaries and meeting obligations? How can we deliver this training and ensure we're upholding whanaungatanga, strengthening reciprocal mana enhancing relationships, connectedness, belonging and inclusion? All of these things were guiding me. How can I deliver the training by adhering to the value or upholding the value of aroha, acknowledging our mutual responsibility for well-being, our common humanity, focusing on strengths and finding solutions? Kōtahitanga, building community, solidarity and collective action, challenging injustice and oppression in all its forms, exploitation, marginalization, powerlessness, cultural imperialism and violence. Matatua, how can I ensure that I'm upholding matatua, acting with moral courage in situations that are uncomfortable, challenging and uncertain? Here I am embodying matatua right now. We're using critical reflection and questioning to work through those contradictions and complexity. How could I ensure I was upholding wairuatanga, attending to the well-being, the spiritual, the emotional, psychological and physical of myself and of others, and acknowledging the significance of whakapapa. So self-awareness and self-care. So when I looked at these values, they clearly guided me to do what I was leaning towards, and that was to change the training to ensure it didn't reinforce cultural bias and system inequity, but instead educated people about the impacts of colonization, the potential for implicit bias. And when I was really guided by our social work values and what that meant and what it meant to be tangata tiriti, I knew what to do. I needed to embody matatua and be courageous and critically reflect on my impact on the communities I'm working to serve and address the fact that this training may not enhance rangatiratanga. In fact, it could diminish it if the participants felt that this was the only way to protect children, as this is best practice. Thus, they may feel disempowered to utilise Indigenous values and knowledge in this mahi. So I leaned into the values of whanaungatanga and kōtahitanga, and I reached out to my connections in a kaupapa Māori social service, and we talked about this training, my reflections on it, and how I wanted to enhance rangatiratanga of kaimahi Māori by providing child protection training that met their needs. I expressed that their knowledge from Te Ao Māori was critical because I didn't have that in adapting the training so that it educated tauiwi to meet whānau Māori's needs, as well as enabling kaimahi Māori to get training that acknowledged their wisdom and ways of working. So the values of manaakitanga and aroha assisted us in creating the space to do this work. We organised a get-together, and the service welcomed us with tikanga, and that created and held the physical and spiritual space for us all, whilst I provided the framework for our kaupapa. I, along with a colleague, delivered 2 full days of free training for that service for all the kaimahi in exchange for 2 hours at the end of each day of training of focus group style feedback on the content. Now, I made it abundantly clear at the beginning, my ego was left at the door. I wanted and appreciated all of their feedback, warts and all, give it to me, all of it. And I promised I would not be defensive of the content or try to negotiate the reasons for it being there. I was completely open to listening and only asking questions of the feedback to fully understand their position. And it was an incredible and very humbling process to be a part of. Very open, honest, and critical feedback was given with aroha and manaakitanga, and it really felt like we were all in it for the same purpose, to get this training to where it needed to be. So for the focus group session, the big group split off into smaller groups where they had big sheets of paper and prompt questions listed that I'd pre-written. And there was a lively discussion in the smaller groups. And when we came back to the big group and shared thoughts and debriefed, this brought up even more amazing ideas. So my team, we agreed to go back through go away and go through the feedback, process it, and make changes as we could to the training, sending it back to them for review once completed, which we did, and that resulted in further feedback and further review. So it was a bit of a process. And the main themes of the feedback were these on the slide. So the idea of best practice, we had a slide that had best practice and child protection best practice. And they critiqued that slide saying that's a Western notion, it can be problematic for kaimahi Māori. That Te Ao Māori is guided by tikanga and kawa rather than a concept of practice, and they are ways of being in life as a whole rather than working or in practice. So that was those terms that were problematic. And all that they embodied. The use of the term child-focused was raised, or child-centered, presenting issues for Te Ao Māori as it individualizes the child away from the whānau. How to balance, so we were left with that tension of how to balance paramountcy of the child, centering children in a whānau-centered approach. And then we were guided by the Kaimahi to incorporate Te Ao Māori values, because they said doing with aroha in specific relation to things like raising concerns with whānau, being open and honest with them, and sharing of their information. If it's done with aroha and kaitiakitanga, it will be guided towards the correct goal, even if difficult along the way, which it will always be, and everyone's mana upheld in the process. So they were the main themes of the feedback, along with general feedback of include Aotearoa statistics, research and resources, not just stuff imported from the UK and Australia. Include and make reference to Māori hauora models, and talk about the violence of and impacts of colonisation on current violence and abuse. So they were all things that we were guided to look at and adapt, as well as practical things like the Kaimahi said, make sure that you cover when considering non-accidental injuries and bruising on children, make sure you talk in this training about the presence of congenital, and excuse my pronunciation of this, but it's a hard word to say, congenital dermal melanocytosis, which is the bruising that can happen on people of origins that have a lot of melanin in their skin. So darker skin, you can have this, what looks like bruising, and it's often around the trunk of the body. And so the Kaimahi said, make sure in your training you talk about that, because when thinking about bruises on children, to make sure people are not making unnecessary and potentially traumatic reports of concern about that, because we can find out if that's on their records with Plunkett nurses and GPs, etc. So clearly that service I did the work with, providing that free training for and getting their open feedback, do not speak for all tangata whenua. So alongside that feedback, we also went to our post-training surveys, because in our training that we ran, we always did post-training surveys. And we went to those surveys and we scoped them for relevant feedback that we needed to incorporate as well. And where there was pertinent feedback or themes, we incorporated those changes as well. So then that was an ongoing process. As we delivered the training, we reflected on feedback and made adaptations as needed. So how am I going for time, Claire? How long have I got left?
Yeah, we're quarter two, so it'll be good to start some Q&A when you're ready, Ruth. Thank you.
Okay, cool. So one more slide. So we got to work. We incorporated a lot of the framing early in the training around impacts of colonisation. We referenced Māori knowledge in relation to child rearing, parenting and protection, quoting Māori thought leaders where possible. Because what we're trying to do is educate Te Iwi providers, as well as making sure the content was appropriate for our Kaimahi Māori and Kaupapa Māori services. So we ensured that we communicated that Māori values were protective of children, and there had been a loss of that traditional knowledge and ways of enacting that due to colonisation. We referenced the work of Paula Toku King et al., who in Oranga Mokopuna presents a tangata whenua rights-based approach, also demonstrating that a whānau-centred approach has children firmly in the centre. So we found ways of adapting the training to address all of the feedback and incorporate meaningful changes. However, a real challenge was that concept of best practice. And my reflections on that as I sought out reading and thought on that concept developed into realizing that was a core tenet of child protection and child protection training. And thus, what best practice is actually saying is that it's best for all people everywhere at all times, which when we think about all that we've just been thinking about doesn't sit quite right. It risks reinforcing that Eurocentric approach. So I set about trying to find a way through this. And that's when I discovered this concept of wise practice, first discussed by Toms 2007 in a health campaign with First Nations people of Canada, and explored by Wesley, Eskimo and Kallio 2010 in their literature review of work in this space. It was actually about Indigenous leadership in community development and economic planning. But I thought some of that concept fits well when thinking about best practice in child protection training. So that quote there is from that work by Wesley, Eskimo and Kallio. So if I just give you a minute to read that. So critiquing that best practice approach. So Hilton 2002 also notes that there is considerable variation. So this is talking about Canada, native people, Aboriginal. They use the word Aboriginal because that's the words that were used in that study. So considerable variation in Aboriginal beliefs and traditions from one Aboriginal community to another. Therefore, there is no unified set of best practices, but rather many such practices that emerge from diverse cultures and community experiences. Toms added that the term best is a hierarchical, non-Aboriginal construct and is concerned that the emphasis on best studies tends to create a reliance on the lessons learned in large, well-funded, academically directed studies that marginalize Aboriginal knowledge learned on the front lines through socio-cultural insight, ingenuity, intuition, long experience in those spaces. So just trying to whiz through so we've got enough time for Q&A. So that's where I landed. So this was in community development approaches, but I thought that this was helpful, a helpful framing around that critique of best, use of best, and instead using this idea of framing it as wise practices. So some commentators have argued that Indigenous people must build from a cultural basis rather than discarding cultural and traditions. Others have argued while it's important to learn modern development knowledge, it ought to be reconciled with traditional cultural values, practices, or processes. So I decided that alongside promoting a rights-based approach teaching practical skills, I would reference this wise practices concept instead of best practice. I could see its usefulness in this work. So we started to explicitly state that the practices recommended for safeguarding and child protection from a Western Eurocentric experience and worldview need to be reconciled with your long-established proven ways of being and doing in relation to safeguarding and child protection training. In other words, our training, we needed to facilitate those working in organizations with a specific cultural approach or who were working with specific communities to reconcile these practical ways of working with their own cultural ways of being and doing, and ongoing learning that is critical to that work. So much of that is values-based. So in that training, we've got to assist those being trained to recognize practical skills with their values. Now, that's wise practices. Now, this work in Canada is bigger than how I'm presenting it. It involves working alongside Indigenous people to do the work, but it helped frame the training away from best practice, one size fits all. So over the next 2 years, I delivered that new content, traveling to Northland twice, 9 months between each visit, and delivering 3 full-day trainings in Kaikoui, Kaitaia, and Whangarei on the first visit, followed by further trainings adding in Kerikeri 9 months later. Feedback from that was that Kaimahi found it very helpful and appreciated the framing. Survey feedback ended up with some further adaptation. So I realized we'd done a good job at adapting the training as it was well received. And the training, the discussions were chunky. We were getting into it, not just listening and thinking this is a westernized approach that is not helping. We were getting into the sticky stuff, which is exactly where we needed to be. So with the announcement last week that government has accepted all the recommendations of Dame Karen Patusi-Allen's report, including that child protection training is made mandatory for specific workforces, which I absolutely applaud for the reasons we've discussed today, because I think it will have a positive impact on our statistics of abuse of children by providing those much needed practical skills. I also strongly believe that training must consider the possibility that it may reinforce implicit bias and structural inequity for Māori Pacific whānau and all people of non-European Western cultures. Thus, it's even more important at this time that training providers go through a process to ensure it engages the communities they're training and work alongside them to develop training that enables those cultural ways of being and doing, their values to be an integral part of safeguarding and protecting children. So we started by looking at how the training was adapted for working with Māori as tangata whanua, but that work needs to include how it's delivered for other groups disproportionately impacted by systemic and personal violence. So this work is not finished. It's a work in progress. Child protection training needs to grow and adapt in Aotearoa. I think next steps are co-creation of child protection training, ensuring that those communities, including ethnic migrant communities, faith communities, are the ones co-creating the training to ensure it's relevant, meaningful, and talking to the systemic issues those groups face. Also, just final point, I just want to say child protection training is just a piece of the whole child protection system that continues to be under scrutiny and review for its outcomes for Māori and Pacific whānau particularly. This approach that I'm discussing is a short-term view that in the meantime work while that system is this way. But there's another view that's longer term and involves more transformational thinking of our systems as opposed to a colonized system that is culturally sensitized. That was a speedy end. Apologies. I had timed myself and it was right on 25 minutes, but how are we doing? We've got a few minutes left for questions.
We do. And unless you have, if you want to talk to the slide, Ruth, we would love to go into a question and answer section. I'm
So
just
I
going
thought having
to.
this quote up while we have questions is a nice reminder of what I'm trying to do here.
So we do have a comment from Tina, which I'm going to read out, and if it can form a question for you, that would be great. So Tina says, ngā tikanga matatikia, something I'm still searching for in the power and control of child, youth and family services, refuse to call them our te reo taonga. Instead, there is a form of social worker that looks like that of a detective inquiry. When is it going to change? Whānau and tamariki who support each other are treated with disrespect and their mana is diminished. What is failing is the lack of understanding that whānau have forgiveness, compassion and aroha. How about starting from that engagement first and work from there? Ngā mihi.
I think, what I'm opening up a discussion about is a small part of a whole system that, like I said, is under huge scrutiny for poor outcomes. So, yeah. I think there's a lot of work to do in this space.
We have another question, Ruth. What training providers or trainings would you recommend organisations can access now?
So, as I said, the work that I did adapting training was with safeguarding children, and that training content that we went through this process with is still the training that they deliver. I'm no longer delivering that training with them, so I stand in this awkward place of that I've just left their organisation. But that training that I adapted is what they still deliver. There are multiple training providers. I believe we've got some of our training providers probably online today. But I can't talk to, I've never done their trainings and I've never delivered their trainings. So I don't know what that content is. I was too busy doing our mahi. But there's multiple, but I feel like we ask the right questions of those training providers. Do you approach these issues? How do you address the systemic inequities? Do you address colonization? In those, when we approach people for training, ask those questions. That's what people asked of us. And that was another prompt for us, for me to actually make sure that we were doing that. So I think demand more from our training providers would be, and ask those questions.
And as you said, Ruth, there are certainly some other providers that are represented on this Clan Kōrero today. So perhaps when I open the chat up at the end again, you could pop your details in there if you do want to answer that on behalf of the person who asked too. Thank you. There's another question here. What do you believe are the next steps needed to ensure that child protection training is fit for purpose in Aotearoa? Maybe the first one or two next steps, because I know there will be many.
I believe that co-creation of content training and co-facilitation, co-delivery is what's needed. I believe that child protection training providers need to actually work alongside tangata whenua, tangata moana, our faith communities to develop training that specifically talks to their cultural values, their ways of knowing of safeguarding and of child protection, so that it is actually woven together with the practical skills of how to respond to disclosures. So it's not just a Eurocentric model taking some ideas, but it's actually co-creation of that training and co-delivery of that training. Because
Thank you.
you can only talk to what you know, and that's what I want to do today as well is, and what I've always done in our training is state my position and what I know and what I don't know. I can't talk to those values from your community because I haven't got that worldview. They're not the values that I know well. So we need to accept our place, don't we, and the boundaries and the ends of our knowledge, and work with the people that do have that knowledge to ensure the training encompasses all that it needs to.
And organisations like ourselves can certainly be in a position to amplify and to engage across if there's information that needs to be shared in that respect as well. And it seems like there's a lot of reaction support for that position too, Ruth. So thank you for that. I
But I
can't
think
see.
just
Sorry.
reflecting on that wise practices slide a bit more in that wise practice concept, that's exactly what came out of that work in Canada, was that's what wise practice is taking research and evidence and practical skills and knowing what they are and working with people from communities who need those practical skills alongside and them driving it from their perspective. So that is wise practice rather than this notion of best practice. And I think that's a powerful shift in that framing, away from this is the best way, this is the only way. It's wise to work in that way.
Thank you. We've got one more question in the Q&A, and then I'm just going to give one opportunity to open it in case people would just prefer to take themselves off mute to ask a question before we wrap up the session. In your engagement with communities, was there a shared view on harm to children as well as harmful child protection practice?
Yeah, that actually came up quite a bit. And so what the discussions that we would end up having would be around positive parenting practices and what that looks like in different communities and different cultures, because that varies. And so again, we used to talk about, so there's the law of, no physical violence towards children in Aotearoa. But then alongside of that, we've also got what would be protective and safe parenting is different in different cultural spaces. So yeah, there was lots of discussion around that.
Thank you.
And I
I'm
mean,
just going
even like attachment, recognition of positive attachment, that's different in different cultural spaces, isn't it? And groups. So yeah, again, the importance of co-creating so that that isn't one size fits all in terms of protective parenting or positive parenting, and what harm looks like, because that is a cultural view as well. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm just letting everyone know I have opened up the chat if there's any information you want to share amongst yourselves before you leave. And just opening up to if anyone else has perhaps one final question you'd prefer to just ask Ruth by coming off mute. We've got time for one more. And of course, feel free to pop your questions into the chat for afterwards, as Ruth has agreed to answer any that cannot fit within the time frame of the Kai and Kōrero today. No one else that feels like they have the burning need to ask right now?
Sorry,
Okay.
I was just wondering whether we'll be
Thanks,
able to
Silky.
get the slides.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm sorry if you weren't here at the start, Silky, but we have said that we will share the slides along with the recording of the session as resource materials afterwards.
All right,
For
thank you
sure.
very much.
Okay, well, if there's no one else that wants to, I'll just check the Q&A, check the chat. that wants to ask a question, it leaves me to close us off as we started. Firstly, with a big thank you to everyone who's joined us here today for our final Kai and Kōrero for 2025. We really appreciate that you give the time and have the opportunity to just, as I said at the start, bind together during these times. Any opportunity is a good opportunity for us to come together. So thank you for taking that time. Thank you for giving us your reflections and feedback as well, and your pātai. And Ruth, in terms of the session itself, really valuable in talking about that value of how you express the guiding values of yourself, of your profession, and of course of tangata tiriti, to go into all of the work that you do. It was so lovely to have that represented today and expressed in your own way. The depth of knowledge, experience, as well as the research and the applied skills that you have brought to this work is amazing. I really appreciate how you've shared that. And also the process of partnership and how that can actually work in your experience and the way that you have done that through this particular area of work. Ruth and I definitely share a mutual synergy around the great value of learning and educating, and that's another aspect of what you've shared with us here today and all the work that you've been doing over many years, Ruth. So a big thank you for your mātauranga and for the wise practice that you have shared as well with us today. Thank you. It's lovely to see so many teams that were here together on the Kai and Kōrero to extend that learning. And I'm sure you've had some good kōrero yourselves while we've been having this session. And it's really awesome also to see that we've not just had our members, but we've had some other sectors joining, as well as across academia and perhaps across the government agency sector too. So we get to truly have that whakawhanaungatanga and that engagement. So thank you again, everyone, for being here with us. The last thing I would like to do is to finish as we started with a karakia whakamutunga. And as we said, we will certainly share out these resources today with all of our whānau that haven't been able to make it with us. So I wish you well into your days as I share karakia whakamutunga.